So what we're going to do is that we're going to use a tool called Routersploit. And now what it's going to do is it's going to go through all of the vulnerabilities that it has in its database and see whether or not there's any vulnerabilities in there. So this is a simple way of going and testing your IoT devices.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Yaniv Hoffman, and today we are exploring the world of IoT hacking. As IoT devices become more common, so do security risks they pose. For that, joining me today, Master Hacker, Occupy the Web. Welcome.
Thank you, Yaniv. It's always an honor to be invited to be on your show. I think this is a really important topic, so I'm hoping that you get a lot of viewers and a lot of people become more aware of the risks and the potential vulnerabilities that IoT poses in cybersecurity in 2024 and forevermore, because IoT is proliferating at an incredible rate. We're talking about billions and billions of devices that are vulnerable to attack and then being used for botnets and DDoS attacks. So what we want to talk about today is just this threat and some of the ways that one can protect themselves, right? And ways that a security professional can test and see whether or not their IoT devices are secure or not. So let's discuss this area, and I want to pull up a couple of recent articles that have appeared on IoT, and we can kind of just discuss some of the pertinent issues before we get into talking about hacking IoT. Okay, so as you can see, this is an article from a blog post called Host Duplex. Okay, it's top 10 IoT device vulnerabilities to enhance IoT security. All right, this came written by this guy 5 months ago. Okay, now look at that. This is the growth, okay, of IoT devices. All right, so we're talking about 29 billion within 6 years. So right now we're at about 17 billion. That's doubled in just the last 5 years, and then it'll almost double again in the next 5 years. So we're talking about a lot of devices, and if and when somebody is able to hack, attack, control even a small fraction of these devices, it could be devastating in terms of what it can do in terms of DDoS and other types of attacks, right? And these devices, because they're being churned out at such a high rate, they're often security is an afterthought. They're just trying to crank these out one after another. And sometimes they're very, very inexpensive devices. So I mean, it's not unusual for some of these devices to be less than $50, right? $20, right? They're very inexpensive devices. That's why they're proliferating, is because they're inexpensive devices connected to the internet. So all it requires is somebody to be able to figure out a flaw, a vulnerability in one of these, say a billion of these devices that are out there, and be able to control them. And we've had examples in history. You probably remember the Mirai Botnet, right? Now, let's talk about that before we go any further. Let me just bring up a quick article on the Mirai Botnet, and we can discuss that. So those of you who have been around the industry a while know about this attack. It's nothing new, but those of you who are new and still learning, this was a devastating attack. Okay, Mirai is a malware that infects smart devices that run on ARC processors, turning them into a network of remotely controlled bot or zombies. This network of bots is called a botnet. All right, so once the attacker has control over all of these, now these IoT devices often have a very small processor and a very, very small Linux kernel, right? They are very, very small. So one of the things that people often ask me about is, should I spend time, becoming an expert in Linux? right? Well, here's a good example where that is actually to your benefit. Not only say running Kali or running a server, but the more you know about Linux, the more you're going to understand the vulnerabilities of these very tiny Linux operating systems. And there's a couple of companies that make these very small Linux kernels. Monte Vista is one of them. If you want to play around with a very small Linux kernel looking for vulnerabilities, there's OpenWrt is a project that builds Linux operating systems that are used for IoT devices, routers, and what have you. And you can download, here's the OpenWrt project. This is the OpenWrt project, and they have hundreds of Linux operating systems that are designed to work on various devices, right? So they built this to basically replace the operating system in your router or other IoT devices. All right, so this is it here. I've got one of them here that I can show. Here's OpenWrt. It's one of the many operating systems that they have. There it is right there. And this is a very, very small. I think this one's like 200 megs, right? So it's 200 megs versus 2 gigabytes, right? So it's like 1/10 or less than 1/10 the size of your general Linux operating system. These are running like 200, 100. Some of them are 50 megs, very, very small. And so the more you understand about these little Linuxes, the better chance you have of actually breaking them or finding vulnerabilities. And this is something that we do in our upcoming IoT hacking class coming up this fall. So we're going to work on different ways that these can actually be hacked. We'll be doing some advanced Linux in that class so you can better use it to find vulnerabilities in these systems. But let's go back to our host duplex, okay, showing us the exponential growth, right, of the IoT devices, and talks about what is the Internet of Things. Basically, it encompasses physical objects embedded with sensors and actuators that are connected to computing systems via wired or wireless networks, right? So it's all those things that we are now developing that are all connected to the internet. Generally, okay, they're going to have a wireless connection, okay, and generally they're going to have a Linux operating system. That's not true for all. It's just a generalization, right?
Mhm.
So, what are the challenges? Here's some of the issues how the vulnerabilities affect the users. They can become part of a botnet. The attackers can use lateral movement, okay, within their own network. So if this device is, say, a baby monitor in your home, right, or it's a security device. So oftentimes, homes and businesses have IoT devices as security devices. These might be cameras, alarms, sensors, right? So if these can be attacked, then they can be disabled. Now, one of the things that can also happen is that it's possible because these are wirelessly connected, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, generally going to be Wi-Fi, okay, sometimes cell on very large facilities, they'll use a cellular connection.
Mhm.
They can also be DOSed. So you can send a lot of radio traffic. Remember that Bluetooth and wireless, that's all radio signals, right?
Right.
So those can be blocked, okay, by essentially doing like a DOS attack against that connection. And we had some robberies take place recently where the attackers disabled the security systems by basically DOSing the radio signals. So this isn't like this is not like a theoretical. This is real world. This is actually happening where to block a security system, they'll block the connection. All you have to, you don't have to knock out the device. You just have to knock out the connection. And that's what they're doing. They're using radio frequency attacks against the connection. right? So there's lots of ways to attack these devices, and the more they proliferate, the more attacks they're going to be. Let's talk about some of the vulnerabilities. All right, this is a big one right here. Okay, weak hard-coded or guessable passwords.
Right.
So when the Ukrainian government asked us to hack cameras around the country at the beginning of the war, and so that we could keep an eye on what the Russians were doing, we found that probably 10 to 20% of the cameras had weak passwords or default passwords. Right. So that got us into about 10 or 20% there. Okay. So that we use that one. We'll talk about that. Insecure network services, things like HTTP, FTP, Telnet. Okay. Oftentimes you'll find these on these devices, and this is a way to get into it. And oftentimes they're not secured. Right. You have insecure ecosystem interfaces. This is are the top 10 vulnerabilities that make IoT devices insecure. These refer to web, backend API, cloud and mobile interfaces, and ecosystem outside the device that allows compromise of the device.
Mm-hmm.
Lack of secure update mechanisms. So generally in our world, right, when we have a known vulnerabilities, the developer of the software puts out a patch, we put the patch in place, and we have. But with IoT devices, that's not always the case, right? Because sometimes they don't have a good way to do firmware updates, right? And this is true in a lot of IoT devices, no matter what it happens to be, whether it be the key fob on cars, right? Or the garage door openers, or cameras, or in the big picture, the SCADA devices. So SCADA devices can be considered IoT when they're connected to the internet, SCADA being industrial systems. And the problem with industrial systems in terms of patching vulnerabilities is that to patch those vulnerabilities, they have to shut down the system. And if you're an oil refinery, you only shut down the system once a year, right, to do maintenance. You can't shut it down overnight, and then restart it. It takes days and weeks to restart an oil refinery. Right? So they only allow it to be shut down. So patches, if they come out today, would have to wait until the next maintenance cycle. So that's one of the other issues here. Some insecure or outdated components. Okay, maybe the operating systems are old or the firmware is old. The encryption or authentication, okay, is old. Have insufficient privacy protection, unsecured data transfer and storage, improper device, insecure default settings, and lack of physical hardening, meaning that if somebody can actually get to it physically, they might be able to attack it. Right. One of the things that we found with the cameras, the camera hacking, was that we were able to find ways to add ourselves as a user on those systems. So we didn't actually break passwords on some of them, probably 40% of them. What we were able to do is we found some vulnerabilities in the major manufacturers, which, by the way, in camera hacking, there's a couple of companies who really dominate that field, okay? And Dahua is one of them. Okay, it's a Chinese company. They private label their cameras. So they manufacture them in China, and other companies take their cameras and put their labels on them, right? And so if you find a Dahua vulnerability, you're going to find that same vulnerability is in a dozen different manufacturers, because they're all simply putting their label on a Dahua camera. And we did that. That's exactly what we did. And the Dahua camera had a poor mechanism for checking to see whether or not to add a new user. So we actually were adding ourselves as a new user, as a root user too, on those cameras, and we could then we could do whatever we wanted with them. Right? So those were the two biggest mechanisms that we used in that particular type of a hack. Is that we used weak passwords, and then we found a lot of cameras that allowed us simply to add ourselves as a user. Right. So this is kind of some of the basic vulnerabilities that you're going to see in these types of devices. And like I said, there's so many devices, but the thing they almost all share in common is that they're using a small Linux kernel, okay, and they're using a a wireless connection, right? So, like for instance, here, best practices you can see here that ensures that the IoT devices communicate over encrypted networks such as WPA2 PSK and WPA3. But if the password is weak, it's pretty not easy, but it's doable to crack WPA PSK. WPA3 is a little bit harder to crack. Okay. So those are kind of the issues that we're looking at in IoT. And I think it's an underappreciated area of cybersecurity. And I think as we see this incredible growth of IoT devices, remember this graph right here, that's how fast it's growing. Okay, so from 2019, just before the pandemic, okay, to 2030, we're going to see almost a four-fold increase in the number of devices. And we have seen some increased awareness and we have seen some increased attacks. I saw a report the other day that said that IoT DDoS attacks have tripled in the last year, have tripled in the last year. So it's a big deal. And those people who have to,
if I may add here, sorry, OTW, indeed it was triple because when you slave the IoT, first of all, you get good distribution. So it looks legitimate, right? You have many users
right? Yes.
coming from many points, many sources, origins. And second, the request or the attack looks legitimate or disguise itself as part of the legitimate request. So it's also very hard to detect it or accurately detect it until it's too late. And as you say, it's relatively easier to penetrate because security is overlooked. And there are many ways to do it, as it's still not the main focus of these manufacturers.
Yes. These manufacturers are trying to crank out very inexpensive devices as fast as they can, sell them for $20, $50, $100, and they're not securely vetting them. They're not going through a security process that says, this is what we need to do to make these devices secure. All right. And the other thing that we found in some of them is we found backdoors in them. And if you can find the back door that the manufacturer left in, we've seen these as well, where the manufacturer left the back door in for like technical updates, right? If you can find the back door, and basically finding the back door is knocking on all the ports to see which ones are open, using a tool like Nmap, right? Using a tool like Nmap and simply knocking meaning sending a packet to each one of the ports to see which one are open. And you might be surprised to find, oh, there's this port that's open that I've never seen before. Why is that open? Well, it's open. It may be open for tech support. It may be open for updates, but oftentimes there's no authentication on that port. From the history of hacking, and I talk about this in my book, Linux Basics for Hackers, and maybe some of my other books too. But it was a famous case from, I think it was like 2007, 2008, where a hacker by the name of Max Butler found that the Aloha point of sale systems, the point of sale systems are things that restaurants and other retail businesses use to do transactions, had a tech support port open. It was, I think it was 5505, if I remember correctly. And he discovered that. And then he went around and entered well, first of all, he used Nmap to scan all of the systems in the world, many of them, not all of them probably, because there's like 4.3 billion IP addresses, right? And a lot of them. And then he was able to get into those systems and steal credit card numbers. Eventually, it led to his downfall, and he ended up getting caught. And he recently left prison after a 14-year prison term. I checked on him recently. He's back on the street, but I think he got out like 2 years ago. 14 years in prison. That's a long term to spend. So kind of keep that in mind, everybody, when you're thinking about doing that kind of stuff, that the consequences can be significant. And of course, we have to say here that all of that we do here on this show and in my classes is all done for educational purposes only, right? So, we're trying to teach you, we're trying to teach you as best we can with real life examples. But if you do it outside of an educational environment, you risk legal consequences, which brings me to another point. We have a class coming up next week called Criminal Law for Hackers. So we're going to teach cybersecurity professionals, not necessarily hackers, but that's the name of the class. The name of the class is actually Criminal Law for Hackers and Incident Responders and Investigators. And so what we intend to do with that class is to teach cybersecurity pros criminal law, the basics of criminal law, okay? And of course, it varies around the world, so we'll use different examples from different countries. And then how it applies to cybersecurity using, using examples, or real life examples of cases that apply to cybersecurity. So keep heads up for that class. All right. And let's finish up talking about the Mirai Botnet that we had started talking about, which is a good example of one of the most successful, or most devastating attacks using IoT. And here's we were just talking about here. Okay, it says in September 2016, the authors of the Mirai malware launched a DDoS attack on the website of a well-known security expert. Okay, and a week later, they released the source code in the world, possibly an attempt to hide the origins of their attack. And we can see it says Mirai scans the internet for IoT devices that run the ARC processor. This processor runs a stripped down version, so it scans. So like we were doing in our last tutorial, we were looking at Nmap. So Nmap and Shodan are two of the best tools to be able to find the types of devices that can be exploited. That's exactly what they did here, is that they used Nmap and Shodan to find. This processor runs a stripped down version, here it is, of the Linux operating system. Okay, the more you know about the Linux operating system, the better that you can protect and exploit these systems. If the default username and password combo is not changed, Mirai is able to log into the device and infect it. So basically all they're doing is they're using default username and passwords. And this is not too long ago. This is 8 years ago. They got millions of these devices, okay? And they were able to use it to attack a number of different facilities, okay? And we still see a lot of devices that have default or hard-coded username and passwords. Not all of them, of course, but enough that it's dangerous, right? It's enough that it's dangerous. So if you're specifically looking to hack one device, it's the chances of it having a default username and password, I would say, is probably close to like 10% or 20%. But if you're simply looking at all of the devices in the world that have default username and password, then 10%, 20% becomes over 1 billion devices. So it can make a huge botnet, right?
Right.
So that's what these guys were doing. All right. It's simply going out and logging into these machines and taking control of them with default usernames and passwords. With all of that having been said, let's talk about a simple tool that somebody who's new to cybersecurity can use to be able to find these vulnerabilities in these IoT devices. Right? So it's not going to find all of the vulnerabilities. It's not going to allow you to hack all of them, but it's a tool that is a starting point. So what I always tell people is that you always start with the simplest methods first, right? So you don't go out and try to build a 0-day, which might take you weeks, years, months, okay, to develop a 0-day to attack a device that has a default username and password. That would not be smart. Right. that would not be a good strategy, right? And so, because you always try the simplest attacks first, right? The simplest attacks first. So what we're going to do is that we're going to use a tool called Routersploit, right? It's good for finding some of the more basic vulnerabilities and attacks against IoT devices. So I think I've got it here somewhere. Here it is. Yep. Let me show you how to install it, and then we'll use it. All right. So first of all, we've got to go and get it. It's on GitHub. All right. And so we can go sudo git clone, and then I'm just going to copy and paste the URL. There it is. And then go. All right. So it's telling me it already exists because I've already installed it, what have you. But I want to show you how to do it. Okay. Then we're going to go to Routersploit. That's the name of the directory. All right. And then take a look inside that directory. And that's what's inside the directory there. The keys here is you see that there's a file here called requirements. And for those of you who are new to Linux and new to cybersecurity, oftentimes new tools have very specific requirements. They have libraries and other dependencies that have to be installed. And that's what this is all about. It allows us to install those automatically from the contents of that file. Right? So then what we want to do is we want to go, let's see. I think it's go Python 3-m and then pip install -r requirements. Yeah, txt. Make sure you get the txt, otherwise it'll throw an error message saying the file's not found. Okay. And then that'll go through and it'll get all of the requirements, all of the dependencies, the libraries that this tool needs, right? And this is something for those of you who are familiar with Linux, you know this, but for those people who are new to Linux, they're not used to doing these dependencies, and sometimes they can become tedious to try to get them all installed. Using Python and the pip command, it simplifies this task, and that's what we just did, right? So once we have it running, or have it all installed, then it becomes pretty simple. Let's go sudo, all right? And then go Python 3. And it's RSF, okay, -py. So here we have it. We ran Python 3. Yeah, I think Python 3 RSFPY, and it starts the Routersploit, right? And you can see it's meant to, as many tools do now, is they try to emulate the interface of Metasploit. We did a tutorial a few weeks back on Metasploit. So once you get familiar with Metasploit, you'll see that these tools try to act very similar to it. And there's a number of exploits. Okay, so here I did show me a scanners, all right? And there's a scanner called Autopon that just runs all of the various tools against the IP address and port that you're looking at. Here's a camera scan, okay? And then there's a miscellaneous scan. I can go show exploits, right? And these are all the exploits. The developers of this tool did a good job when they began it. It needs a little bit of updating, but it is really good at finding some of these older vulnerabilities. You see, it looks at some of the D-Link devices, yeah, some of the Cisco devices, Microtech, Belkin, Huawei, Technicolor, TP-Link, Netgear. These are almost all routers, all right? And then it also has some Linksys, Netsys, and it has some cameras as well. So here the cameras are all in here, okay? And then I did a help command, right? It shows me the commands. It's going to be obviously the help, and then use, okay, very similar to Metasploit, right?
Mhm.
And then there's going to be execute a command in a shell, search, and exit. So I went ahead and looked for the cameras Dahua, and it came back and said, there aren't any. Basically, it just comes back and gives me a prompt. But then I came back and said, hey, how about Hikvision? That's another major manufacturer of cameras. And it comes back and says, oh, I got 3 modules. Okay, these are credentials. You can see these are creds. Okay, creds mean the credentials for the Hikvision camera, the Telnet and SSH and the FTP creds. All right. So one of the things that we can do is let's pick out an IP address. Now, what we're going to be doing is not illegal. Okay, this is all for educational purposes. But we're just going to pick out an IP address of, say, a IP address that has a camera attached to it, an IoT device. And one of the ways you can find IP cameras is look for port 554, right? They're not all cameras, but they mostly are cameras, right? Because that's the default port for the protocol that the cameras use, which is RTSP, right? So it's, I want to put it up here on the screen, port 554, right? So almost all of them will use port 554. Some of them will use, I've seen 5554. I've seen 8054. So as you know, and it's kind of funny, there was a comment on our last video where I said that you can put any device on any port. And one of the comments that somebody made was like, he's so wrong. That's not true. You know, if it's not on port 80 or 443, you know, all those other ports are TCP ports. Well, you know, that's a very simple view of the world. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. You literally can put any device on any port. All right. Yeah. The distinction is default port versus the actual port. Sure. Right. And I think you answered them correctly in the comments, you know, in that people oftentimes will put like HTTP on port 8080 or 8001, or sometimes it'll be like some random port number of 6542. And that's the way to obscure what's going on. So if I put my web server on port 80, then of course the attacker knows what that is, right? Exactly. It's going to be HTTP. If I put it on 6042, the attacker sees that and goes, I don't know what that is. And so this is what a good cybersecurity professional does, is to put your services on non-default ports. So we're going to just go ahead and randomly choose an IP address. And so I see this one I just went to Showdown. I'm just looking for port 554, the camera port, right? And you can see that, you know, here's one in Taiwan, here's one in another one in Taiwan, Kuwait. But you can see that these are cameras, right? Because the RTS, this is the banner, is showing you it's RTSP, right? And that's the protocol that cameras use, and it can be used on other ports. So if we were to do, let's just look 5554, which is a common alternate port for cameras, you'll find quite a few there too. Let's just see how many we find. All right, so we got 2,000. So yeah, it's not nearly as big. So you can see most people are still using the default ports, right? And they're not changing the port. But you know, people who are more secure will change the port. All right, so let's go back to our 554, and this is random. And all we're going to do is we're going to scan it. Scanning is not illegal, okay? And this is for educational purposes only. So those people at YouTube, you know, the censors at YouTube, and to everybody else, keep this in mind. This is only for educational purposes. No ill intent. We're just trying to show, and from a real world example, what a tool like Routersploit can do. All right, we're gonna just go grab. Here's one in Germany. Let's go. I don't want to anger the people in Germany. We'll grab one in Korea. Okay, and let's go there. Okay. So one of the things we need to do, all right, but I want to do show, let's do show options. So we can see some of the options that, so one of the things you can do is you got to use, just like in Metasploit, all right, you can go ahead and we're going to go ahead and use show scanners just to do scanners. All right. So here's a camera scan. Let's do that one. Since we know this one has, okay, a camera on it. Let's see how effective this is. And I want to kind of reference our previous tutorial that we did on hacking IP cameras, where we used a tool called Camera Radar to be able to break the credentials on cameras. All right, so let's go show options. And here's the camera scan. Okay. So it's going ahead and checking for HTTP. Okay, checking for HTTP SSL. If you set it by default, it's set to false. It checks for FTP, FTP SSL, SSH. So it's basically going through and checking to see whether or not those services are being used. And oftentimes, if they are being used, they can be a vulnerability of that system. Okay. So if you can get in through the SSH, obviously, you can do a lot of control over the system.
Right.
So let's go ahead and say set, okay, target, and we're going to go 14, 47, 52, 3. All right. And so we can see here that everything is set. Okay, let's do a show options again. All right. And so we've got everything set, 8 threads, all the default settings, and then we can just say, we can tell it to just exploit or run. And it's going ahead and scanning that camera, that IP address with the camera, and looking for vulnerabilities. Okay, it's coming back and telling us it's not vulnerable to these attacks, right? Now it's getting into, okay, you see that it's using only the camera exploits. Okay, did a generic heartbleed. Those of you who've been around the industry for a while remember that it was a heartbleed was an attack against the bash shell in Linux, and basically all Linuxes were vulnerable to it. So that's a good place to start. So it looks like, at least on this particular Linux, that they patched it. That's about 2014, I think, somewhere around there. And you can see it's going through various exploits, and these are all camera exploits. Right? It's going next. It's going through a default credential check. And so far, it's not finding any vulnerabilities. So for those people who are in the cybersecurity field and you want to check your IoT devices, this is an excellent tool to go and run against your IoT devices. The only problem I would say with it is that it needs some updating, but it's a good place to start, right? It's a good place to start. It's not the end all. If you really are interested in security of your devices, this is a place to start, but you still need a fair amount of work to do. And we'll be looking at a number of those different attacks against these devices in our IoT hacking class. So it says, could not find any default credentials, and it didn't find any vulnerabilities. That's good. This particular company, it's Korea Telecom, has done a good job of keeping their IoT safe. Now, probably the most widely used routers in the world are made by Cisco, right? Cisco's out there, and they've been around for almost from the beginning of the internet. I think right around mid 90s. Okay, and so they've got a lot. If you go ahead and just search for Cisco on Shodan, you see a lot, like 6 million of them. 6 million. There's a lot of Cisco devices out there. So we're going to pick out one of those, okay? But first of all, what we want to do is we're going to use a different, okay? We're going to use a different
Scanner.
module. Yeah, this time we're going to use what's called auto pawn. And for those of you who've used Metasploit, you know that in Metasploit there's an auto pawn. And basically what it does is it throws everything at the device, at the IP address, seeing if there's a vulnerability. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to use the auto pawn and then throw it at this particular device. And scanners auto pawn. That's what it is. Scanners auto pawn. Once again, those people who are new to cybersecurity, pawn, okay, is a word that you may not be familiar with, and basically it's a typo of own. Okay, so many years ago, at the beginning of hacking, somebody inadvertently or advertently went ahead and typed own, like I own your device, I own your hardware, and put a P in there. So it's part of the history and the culture of hacking. Instead of own, it's pawn. So we're going to use the scanner's auto own or auto pawn. Okay. We're going to do show options. And you can see it's still set for that same IP address. Let's choose a Cisco device. Okay. And notice here, any settings, there's a vendor concerned. We can choose the vendor and then, but let's go ahead and just use a Cisco. I'm going to go ahead and pick out, let's see, who we're going to pick on. Let's just pick on Argentina. All right. I'm going to pick out this IP address. Once again, we're not attacking. We're simply, okay, set target. We're simply scanning, right? And especially if we don't find any vulnerabilities, no harm's done, right? And if you're a cybersecurity pro, this is what you do on your systems, right? You go ahead and just test them to see whether or not they're vulnerable. Right. And that way you can patch them before the bad guys get there. That's the whole idea. The whole idea of ethical hacking or penetration testing is to find the vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. All right. So you have to be vigilant, and because there's always new vulnerabilities coming up. This would be what I would call a first pass on your IoT devices, a first pass. You have several more passes you have to do to make sure that you're secure, but this is your first pass. You always start with the simplest first, and then go on to the more complex. All right. So here we have a new exploit. We have a new target. All right, and let's just do show options again, very almost identical to Metasploit, right? Okay, and we've got our IP address in there, and then let's go ahead and say exploit, exactly the same as Metasploit, and let it run. All right. And now what it's going to do is it's going to go through all of the vulnerabilities that it has in its database, right? And this one says could not be verified, right? And see whether or not there's any vulnerabilities in there. So this is a simple way of going through and testing your IoT devices. And then after you've run this through, then the next step is to go much more specific types of attacks and vulnerabilities against your devices to make sure they are secure. But if you find a vulnerability in this with this tool, you got a problem. You need to get on it right away and patch it, right, to make sure that it's not attacked and that you don't become part of a botnet. And one might say, "Oh well, it's somebody else's problem if my machines are part of a botnet." No, that's not. We're talking about a global cybersecurity community where we all have to do our part to keep the world secure. And in addition, it might become your problem if somebody pivots from your IoT device into your internal network. Because remember, once they are inside your IoT device, it's always easier to attack a network from the inside. than
Right.
it is from the outside. Once I have a foothold inside your network, it's relatively easy to go ahead and pivot to the other devices that are connected to the same network. So
Right.
you got to keep these devices secure. Now, if you were in the business of cyber warfare, and there are a few people who are in that business, right? There's there's a lot of people in that business. You might want to make yourself a botnet, okay, of millions or billions of these devices. And then when the time came, okay, you could use them. You don't have to use them right away. And this is usually what happens. These botnets get built and they're not used immediately.
Right.
Oftentimes they
Right.
sit idle for months and years until they get used. But if you were in the cyber warfare field, you would build your botnet over years and years. And the major powers in cyber warfare, Russia, the US, Israel, China, have done this. They have already done this. And they have these botnets ready to roll when and if the time is needed. Okay? So this is like having millions of soldiers all over the world ready to be called to arms when the time is ready. All right. So this is just one tool. It's a simple tool. It's a tool that anybody can use. We can get a lot more complex. You know, like I was telling you in the camera field, we found ways to add ourselves as users. We found a lot of default username and passwords. We found vulnerabilities in the Linux kernel that we could exploit in these devices. So we'll be talking about all of those in our upcoming IoT hacking class. I think it's in October. So if you're really interested in this field, you know, that's when you want to attend. Also, I want to put out there people that if there's a subject that you really want us to cover, you know, put it in the comments and we'll
Right.
be happy to cover it in future tutorials. And I also want to point out that we're offering 20% off on everything, okay, using coupon code Yaniv. So
Yeah.
Yaniv's name, YANIV, okay, use that at Hackers Arise. You get 20% off on anything, okay?
But as you said, it's very thorough, and you know, Occupy the Web. I was speaking to a lot of cybersecurity professionals and ethical hackers that told me that today it's not that easy even to slave IoTs because already a lot of botnets are controlling them. They change themselves the default password. So
Exactly.
there is a competition of, you know, identifying and slaving them. What I learned is that many of these malicious actors move to what is called bulletproof hosting providers, which offer services that allows a customer to host website applications or other digital content with a high level of anonymity and resistance to take down requests. Mainly, it's countries with, you know, legal regulation that is not that strong, right? They are more
Right.
tolerant for
Right.
hosting malicious activities. So these guys are building the malicious, installing the malicious software there, using their proxies all around the world, and start to attack through these proxies that are changing the IPs all the time, which will make the defense systems, you know, work harder and be more, you know, take them much more time to accurately or at all detect it's a malicious activity. So this becomes like for malware and you know, malware distribution, phishing, spamming, and other cyber
Exactly.
activities. Yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot of countries that don't cooperate with the major powers in terms of legal enforcement of you know, cybersecurity laws, and that's one of the issues that we're going to discuss next week in our criminal law for hackers. But
interesting.
in terms of you were mentioning earlier that you know a lot of these IoT devices that you know when you try to hack them, that there's somebody already there. and and we ran into that in Ukraine, in that sometimes when we'd go into a camera, we'd find the Russians already there. And then sometimes when we would hack a camera, the Russians would come along and they'd hack the same camera and kick us out. And then we'd have to come back and hack them again and kick them out. And we went back and forth like that for a long time. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but
I
that activity we've discontinued because of the way the war has developed, and those cameras are not as valuable as they were at the beginning of the war, when the Ukrainian army wanted to track the potential movements of the Russian army
Right.
into across the country, and that really never happened. There, luckily, they were able to stop them. So yeah, it's not unusual to go into a camera and or other IoT devices and find somebody's already there.
Yeah.
You're not the first one there.
So I think for guys, for everyone that is seeing that, so we have done Occupy the Web, and I did multiple videos around hacking IP cameras, as Occupy the Web mentioned before. I will put it on the screen, leave the link in the description so you can follow. We also did recently active reconnaissance with Nmap and passive reconnaissance with the Showdown as our last video. Today we can see Routersploit as another tool to scan, very powerful tool to scan IoT devices. You know, I was interviewing here, Occupy the Web, maybe more than a year ago, Mikko Aiponen, which is a cybersecurity, also a professional, you know, very familiar figure. He wrote a book on
Mhm.
IoT that is called "If It's Smart, It's Vulnerable."
And that's true. That statement is true.
Exactly. And he, everywhere he goes, he shows he has like a mechanical watch, you know, he says, you know, this is old school. It's not smart. Nobody can hack this mechanical watch. But I also recommend to read this book, which speaks on exactly what you were speaking about here, the growing number of IoT devices into billions, and the vulnerabilities and the exploits that can happen. And I think in the era we are getting in, everything is connected today. Everything is smart in our life. And I see it finished without any vulnerability discovery, which is good, you know. We tried to,
It's good.
looks
Yep.
good, right?
Yep. It looks good. Yeah, but we just want to show the tool and show
Yes.
them how they can use it, and talk about IoT. And it's one of those areas that still is not fully appreciated, I think, by the cybersecurity community. But
Right.
hopefully it does in the as a result of our and Mikko Hipponen's book and his talks about IoT. And we'll be doing a class on IoT hacking in October as well.
So guys, again, you have everything in the store, including all the subscription, books, courses, a 20% discount with the code name Yaniv, Yaniv. And we are listening to you, so we are reading all of the comments, we are addressing it. So whatever topic you are interested in, please leave your comments, and definitely we will review and try to address. Whatever we do here is based on many of the viewers' requests. And with that said, Occupy the Web, thank you so much. Definitely insightful, not only for people that are coming new into this domain, but definitely important for everyone. Today, you can use these tools, scan your own IoT devices, not only at home, in the organization, to be able to maybe find vulnerabilities. Very soon, we are in another video, and speak to you all soon.
Thanks, Yaniv. It's great being with you again.
And for everyone, if you are not a subscriber yet, please do. If you like the video, please click the like button. It will only take you a second. And leave your comments. If you want to see more of such content, please let us know. Occupy the Web and myself are now doing a very constant and frequent videos, and we try to address all of your needs. Again, visit HackerArise site. Make sure you are reading, buying Occupy the Web books, Network Basic for Hackers, Getting Started, Becoming a Master Hacker, Linux Basic for Hackers, which is the basic foundation for everyone that wants to be an hacker. And until the next video, see you and thank you very much.